Hey chaps, welcome back. Today we're going to be cracking on with our editor and actually doing a little bit of work on our game project as well. So today we're going to be adding the ability to preview our map from the editor itself, and by that I mean it will launch the game so we can see that same map in the game project, and moving forward that means we can add more functionality to the game such as walking around, etc. So without further ado, let's just hop straight in and get started on the editor, followed by a little bit of work in the game project. Okay, so let's launch our editor and talk a little bit about the changes we plan to make. So here is our editor. Most of our changes in the editor today are going to revolve around the file drop-down menu and the title text of the window itself. Yes, we're finally going to give it a remotely sensible name. So for the file drop-down menu, what we're going to do is we're going to add a preview button, which when clicked will launch the currently saved map into the game, which we can then use to explore the map and the game's functionality a little bit more moving forward. Furthermore, we're going to give it a proper title, as I said, but also we're going to append the path of the map you're currently working on to that title as well, so you can see if you've saved your map anywhere. Okay, so let's close down the editor and let's begin by adding a few hook methods into our form, which we can then use to set the title text of the window first of all. So we're going to right click on Form1CS and view code. At the bottom, if we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to add 3 new methods. So each of these methods are going to represent the actions to which we want to set the title text of the window, but also whether we want to enable or disable the preview button that we're going to add. So we need 3 main actions. We want a private void on map new. We want a private void on map save. We're also passing the map path, which we can then use to set the title of the window. And then we want private void on map load, which will also pass in the map path. Okay, so we've got our 3 methods. Now we need to be calling them from somewhere. So if we scroll up to where we create a new map, here, MonoGame Editor 1, new map. In here at the bottom, we're going to call on map new. Okay, and at the next stage, save toolstrip menu item, click. Right underneath where we say MonoGame Editor 1, save map and pass in the file stream, we're now going to call on map save. And we're going to pass in for the map path dialog.filename. That's the same file path we used to create the file stream previously. Dialog.filename. Okay. And now we're going to do the same thing for the load. So underneath where we call MonoGame Editor 1.loadMap, we're now going to call on map load. And pass in again dialog.filename. Okay, so we're calling our new methods now. Now we just need to add some logic to them. The beauty of this is we've got 3 simple locations where we can hook into certain behaviors of the map editor. When we create a new map, we know this code will be run. When we save a map, this code will be run. And when a map is loaded, this code will run. Okay, so to set the title text, what we're first going to do is we're going to create a couple of constant strings to represent that title text itself. One where it is saved and one where it is not. So we're going to create a private const string title text, all in capitals as a constant. And we're going to make this whatever you like. I'm going to call it just the game editor. And then we're going to create another private const string title text saved. And I'm going to call this the game editor again, but at the end I'm going to put in square brackets, curly brackets 0. Okay, so as a placeholder, when we call string.format, we'll pass it the string, which will be this, and then for the second argument, we'll just give it the map path, which will then conveniently slot into there for us. Okay, so scrolling back down to our methods. So for onMapNew, we want to be able to set the title text of the window just to title text, right? Because we don't have a map that's saved, we just want it to say the title of the window. And to do that's really simple. So we're in the scope of the Form1CS, which is just the form itself. Let's scroll up. You see here, this just extends form. And then form itself has a convenient property of setting title text of the window, which is just text. So on map new, we want to set text to title text. On map save, we want to set text to string.format title text saved. And then the second argument, we'll pass it the map path. And we'll do the same thing on load as well. Okay. So let's test this out real quick. Start our editor. Okay, so here's our map. I'm just going to make a couple of changes just to give it a bit of life. Why not? There we go. And then, so here you see, straight away, I've got my game editor title text at the top. And now I want to test if when I save and load a map, it will set it to the map path as well. So if I hit File, Save, Test Map, and Enter. And then straight away, I've got in square brackets the path to my map that I just saved. Okay, so I create a new map now. New, 32, 32, 32, 32. Enter. Resets it back to just the title text without the square brackets. And as a final test, let's try and load a map. Load up the one we just saved. And then once again, you see straight away we've got our map path in the square brackets. Okay, that's step one. The next step is we need to add a button which then enables or disables depending on whether you have a map saved or not. So if I click this to close it, and then what I'm going to do is right click on Form on CS, View Designer, and then up here in the top left where it says File, I'm going to click that. And where it says Type here, I'm going to click and type Preview. Give that a save. So here's our preview button, okay? And what we want to do is control whether this button is enabled depending on whether your map is saved or not. So going back to Form on CS, I'm going to go to On Map New. What's the name of our preview button? Let's just double check. Click on him. The bottom right is called Preview Tool Strip Menu Item. Okay, so back to Form 1. I'm going to go Preview Tool Strip Menu Item dot enabled. So when I create a new map, we want this button to be disabled, so enabled false. When we save a map, we want this to be enabled equals true. And likewise for when it's loaded as well. Okay, so let's give that a quick test now. Let's start our editor. And if I click File, straight away you can see it's grayed out, it is disabled. If I try and load a map, test map again, File, and there it is, enabled once more. Let's hit New, create a new map, and then it's disabled. And finally, let's save the map, test map 2, save, and then once again it is enabled, which is exactly what we want. So the next thing we need to tackle is how we're going to launch our game. And before we do that, we need to know where our game actually is on the file system. And to do that, we're going to create an editor config class which loads from a file. And that file itself is going to contain some settings, one of which is where our game is stored on the file system. Okay, so in our game editor project, we're going to right click, add new item. I'm going to create a new class and call this editor config. Okay, so I'm going to use a singleton pattern here. Don't worry too much about whether this is a good or a bad idea. People can debate that all day long. I'm not suggesting this is the best way of doing it, but I'm also not suggesting it's the worst either, for the sake of just getting something done, and it's all just fun and playful anyway. Alright, so we're going to create a private static editor config instance. Okay, and what this means is, with it being static, there's only going to be ever one instance of the config. Next, we need to create it or retrieve it. So I'm going to create a public static editor config get. This get method is going to return either this instance or create the instance if it doesn't yet exist. So first of all, where are we going to be loading this config from? So I'm going to create a const string editor config path, and this is going to load from a file called editor.json. Yes, our good friend Json. We can always rely on him. Okay, so first of all, does the instance exist? If it doesn't, we need to create it. So instance is equal to JSON convert, control period, and then we want using Newtonsoft JSON. And then we're going to use the serialize object, if I can spell, the serialize object, and this needs to be a editor config, and then we're going to give it a file path. And that file path is as specified up there, editor config path. And then lastly, all we need to do is return that instance. Okay, so that's our editor file. This is the deserializing of that file into an object in memory. The next and last thing we need for this is the name of the properties that will be in that file. And the only thing we care about at this time, although we can add as many as we want in future, is just public string client executable path. Get set. Okay, so that's our editor config class. In fact, one last thing I'm going to do here before we move on is just add a check to make sure this file actually exists before we try and load from it. So underneath the editor config path constant here, I'm going to do if the file does not exist, so file with a exclamation mark at the front, control period using system IO dot exists, pass in the editor config path, and then if it doesn't exist, I'm going to throw a new file not found exception and say editor config file not found. And then what I want to do is stick editor config path on the end. There's a couple of ways we can do this. We've done it before. We can just use a plus and put editor config path. But I'm going to use a $sign here just to inject that variable in there. It's like a shorthand for string.format. So I'm going to use curly brackets and then editor config path. Alright, sweet. So if I try and run this code now, if that file doesn't exist, I'll get an exception and it'll be very obvious what's gone wrong, instead of something failing internally in this area here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to load our editor config in via this method here and validate some of the properties in here. Obviously we only have one for the client executable path, but we're going to load that in and make sure this file actually exists before we launch the editor itself. So heading over to the form1.cs file, we're going to scroll up to the constructor for form1, and we're going to add a new method here, private void validate config. And then in this method, we're going to pull out the config, so editor config, just call this config and editor config, and using our get method right there. Okay, and what we're going to do, similarly for what we did for checking if the editor JSON file existed, we're going to check if the client executable file has existed. So if we do if the file does not exist, file that exists, and then we're going to pass in config.client executable path. Like before, we'll throw a new file not found exception, and we'll say client executable not found, and stick the name of the file path in there, but like before. So we'll use config.client executable path. Okay. Last thing we need to do is just call this from our constructor. So just before initialize component, I'm going to call validate config. So let's give our editor a quick run now and see what happens. So straight away, file not found for the editor config, which is exactly what I'd expect to see because we haven't created it yet. So let's close that back down. And under the game editor, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add new item. I'm going to make this a text file. I'm going to call this editor.json. Now the reason I went for text file there doesn't really matter too much. I could have just as well picked a class and deleted the content. The text file simply just appears blank, so it's just easier to work with. Okay, so what we're going to do now is create a JavaScript object in here so we can store our config. So we'll create a JavaScript object. We're going to open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And the one property we have is client executable path. So the question you're probably wondering now is what the hell do we even put in here? Where do we know it needs to point to? So working that out is relatively straightforward. Now bear in mind we're running from the editor, so we need to work out how to get from where the editor is running to where the client will be. In our case, that's quite straightforward. If we right click on the game editor and do open folder in File Explorer, this will take us to the actual project path of that project. So what I'm going to do is go to bin debug, and then this is the executable which when we click debug is actually run, and this is where it's run from. So for a clear-cut example, and what we're going to do here is we need to work out how to get from here to the client executable path, and that means we need to jump back a few folders. So we're in debug now, we need to jump up once to bin, twice to game editor, and then 3 times to the directory which holds all the projects. So to jump back 3 times, we're going to do ... backslash backslash ... backslash backslash, and then ... backslash backslash. Now the reason I'm using 2 backslashes is because it's an escape character, otherwise it will just throw an error like that. Okay, because an escape character is expecting something like a backslash R or a backslash N or something like that, so you need 2. Okay, so at that point, we are now at the root directory of the projects. We just jump into the game, and then bin, and then debug, and that's where our game executable is. Okay, so we need to do the game, bin, debug, and then the game.exe, and that is where our client or our game lives. Alright, so lastly, let's close this down and set up our editor JSON file so it's actually copied to the output of the project. As you can see here, we're just referring to editor.json, and that means it's expecting it to live alongside the executable itself, and currently it does not, it's sitting at the project level. So if we right click on editor.json and properties, just to make sure we get the properties window, if we change the copy to output directory to copy if newer, that just means whenever there's some changes, it will copy the editor.json file to the bin debug folder of the game editor. And I just realized there's a mistake here. We need to change this to file.readAllText. Otherwise, it will be trying to actually compile or deserialize the path editor.json and not the content of the file. Okay, let's give that a quick run now and see what happens. And there we go. All loaded fine, no problems there. Let's close it down and make sure we've got the right executable path from the config file as well. So let's go to form1cs, and then we'll pop a breakpoint here on the file exists line, run that again, and then we'll hover over config, expand that, and you can see we've got the client executable path as expected. It passes this check and therefore doesn't throw an exception, so that's all good, and we're ready to move on. The next thing we're going to do is tackle how we want our game to load the map when we click that preview button. And we're going to do that using command line parameters. You may have seen and used these before in the past when you've modified the shortcut of a game, such that you've added extra options at the end of the target path and done the same thing in Steam by modifying the launch options. Okay, so to do that, we're going to go to our game project, right click and manage NuGet packages. And then browse, we're going to look for command line. The package we're going to use is command line parser right here. Latest version, stable 2.8.0 is what I'll be using. So if I install that. Okay, so with that installed, the next thing to do is actually make use of that package. Now how this package works generally, out of the box, and the quickest and easiest way of doing it, is to prepare a class of which it will then use to store the command line parameters in, which I will do right now. So in the game project, I'm going to right click on the game project, add new item, and we're just going to create a new class called launch options. Okay, and in this class for launch options, we're going to add one of the options that we want to use for the launch options, and that is to set a map. So I'm going to create a public string map with get set, and then to make this usable by the command line parser, we need to give it an attribute. So in our attribute, we're going to give it the option attribute. We need to control period using command line, and then in brackets we're going to give it a few parameters of its own. So the name of the parameter we want to be is map, so this is the name of the parameter that will be used on the command line, and then the value will be assigned to this variable. Okay, required we're going to set to false. It's not required, but we can use it to quickly load up a map if we want to. And then lastly, we can set some help text. So if you enter an invalid command line argument, it can then offer some help text as to what the valid values for it are. So this I'm just going to say provide a map to load up initially. Okay, so that's our command line argument set up. We now just need to populate the options. And how we're going to do that, we're going to go to the main program class of the game. So if we go to program.cs under the game project, then right under the first call into using main game, our game equals new main game, we're going to create our command line arguments. So remember, we created our new class, launch options, so we'll create an instance of that first of all. And then we're going to populate it with the command line arguments which come from here. Okay, and to do that, we use a class that comes with the NuGet package we just installed called parser. We need to hit control period using command line. And then we're going to just go for the default parser. And then to actually pass the options into this class, we need to essentially deserialize it very similarly to what we do with JSON. Now it's not strictly deserialization, but that's the closest comparison you can draw from it. Okay, so we need to call parse arguments. We'll give it the type of the class, which is launch options, and then feed it the arguments array that come in here. And then lastly, all we need to do is assign that to our options class here, options instance. So with parsed, and then it passes in a lambda function here, and then we just set options equals O. Okay, so basically that's saying parse these arguments, and once you've parsed them, store the result in this class here. Okay, so now all we need to do is pass the options to our game class so they can specify a map to load. But before we dive into that, let's have just a quick explore on how this actually works. So if I go back to my launch options class here, remember I said we've set required to false, and then there's some help text. If I run the game right now as it stands, it'll just run as normal with nothing really to say. But if I made this required, set this to true, run the game, and you'll see there's some help and advice offered in the command line as to what's missing and how to specify it, and that's what that means. So note here it says -- map. That's how we will set the map to load when we launch the game. So we'll set the map path, space, -- map, and then the name of the map we want to load. Okay, so that's how that works. If I set this to false now, let's go back to the program. I'm going to set a breakpoint here and just check to make sure we can actually populate this correctly and see it populated. So if I right click on game here, properties, I'm going to specify a map, -- map, my test map there. Give that a save. I'm going to right click, debug new instance of my game. We should hit our breakpoint. And if I hover over options here, expand that, you can see for the map property, my test map is there. So that's a nice easy way of passing that information from the editor to our game project. So we've now got a means of passing that information to our game project. Let's actually make the changes in our game project so it will actually load that map if it's specified. So the first thing we want to do is pass these options through to the game itself. So in the constructor for main game here, I'm going to pass options, and then we'll head over to the game class and make some changes to accommodate that being passed in. So over in main game.cs under our game project, let's make a small change here to accept launch options, and we'll call that options, and then we'll store that in the class itself so we can refer to it wherever we like. So private launch options, options, and then the top of our constructor, this .options equals options. Obviously the this is required because they're called the same thing. Okay, so we're passing our options in. The next thing we need to do is actually load our map if it's specified. So here, right now, by default, we're just loading a brand new map, which we don't want to do. We want to load a new map if there is one being specified. So here, let's just move this underneath to keep it tidier because we're going to add some new logic. So underneath here, we're going to say if string is null or whitespace options.map. So if there is no map specified, we'll fall back to the default option of just creating a new map, which makes sense. That's exactly what we want to do. Now the next scenario, of course, is if we actually specify a map to load. So we need an else. So if we do specify a map to load, we need to actually load the map. And we can do this exactly the same way we do it in the editor. So all we need to do is create a file stream using file stream. Oh, fill mode. File stream. Oh, this is a car crash. Control period, system IO. There we go. So we'll call that file stream equals file.openRead options.map. And now all we'll do is just load the map based on that file stream. So my map equals new map, and then we'll pass in the file stream. And that's exactly how we do the same thing in the editor. So now if we don't specify a map, it will load a empty default one. But if we do specify a map, it will try and load that map. So there is a little bit more housekeeping we need to do in the game to prepare it for loading a map, and that is create an instance of the Bootstrap. Now you may remember we created this in the editor a while back just to orchestrate some of the setting up and loading of the map and tile sets, etc. We haven't done this in the game because we haven't touched the game project in quite a while, so we need to introduce that here now. Okay, so we're going to create a new variable to store the Bootstrap. So private Bootstrap. We'll just call it Bootstrap. And then in our initialize method, we'll instantiate our Bootstrap. So Bootstrap equals new Bootstrap. This could be set up exactly the same as the one in the editor. So if we head back to the editor now, under the MonoGame editor, right click view code, find how we set up that Bootstrap here, and we'll just use the exact same constructor. Close that. And then we'll paste it here. Okay, so we've set up a Bootstrap. And then finally, we need to make sure when we're drawing our maps, we use the tile sets that are in the Bootstrap and not just an empty list. Otherwise, it won't draw our map correctly. So bootstrap.tilesets. And that's it. Our game project is ready to load maps on demand. So the final piece in this puzzle is to actually load the game from the editor when we click that preview button. So let's go ahead and create a button handler for that preview button. So over in Form 1 CS Designer, I'm going to click the File button here, double click on Preview so it automatically creates a click handle for us, and then we'll start filling this in with functionality. Alright, so what do we need to launch the game from our editor? Well, the first thing we need to know is where the hell the game is, and we created the config for that. So we need to create an instance of the editor config, so editor config equals editor config.get. So the config has our executable path for the game itself. So to actually create and launch an instance of the game from the editor, we use something called a process. So we'll create an instance of a process, many to control period, using system diagnostics, and then we'll just create process, new process, and then we'll set some parameters on this as well. So we'll just use opening curly brackets, and then we'll set the start info of this process to a new process start info, and then we'll set some details on that as well. So there's two things we need to know about starting this process. The first thing is, where is the client executable located? So to do that, we specify a file name, and then we'll get the config.client executable path. Now remember, when we filled in the client executable path, we set it as a relative path. So we had a dot dot backslash backslash dot dot backslash backslash, etc. For the benefit of any doubt, I'm going to convert this into a full path. So it'll turn those dot dot backslashes into the full path. So it's like C, my folder, etc. Then the full location. So to do that, I'm just going to use path dot get full path and pass in the executable path. Now the next thing we need to do is set the arguments. Remember, we have a dot dot dash dash map, and then we specify the name of the map and where to load it from. So to do that, we set arguments, and then we set this to dash dash map, and then oh wait, we need to get the name of the map. Currently, we're not storing that information anywhere at all. So what I'm going to do is create a variable before we go any further. At the top of this form here, I'm just going to create a private string, and I'm just going to call this current map path. Okay, and we're just going to populate that when we hit any of the three actions we created earlier. So when we create a new map, we'll just set current map path to string. Well, actually, I'll just set it to null. Okay, map save, we'll set current map path to the map path we passed in, and then the same thing for load as well. So now we have the map path. Next, we just need to pass it through to this map parameter here. So I'll use the $sign here, and then I'll inject the map path in here. There's one thing I think we need to do here, and that is we need to turn this as well into the full path. So this one may be relative as well. So we go path, get full path, and then we'll pass in the current map path. Now there is also one thing to remember here, that this full map path may have spaces in the name, so we need to surround it in quotes as well. So if I do a backslash quote on the end, that'll just make sure that if there are any spaces in that map path, they still get counted as the same string. Let's put a semicolon at the end there, just so that will compile, and then we're going to start our process. So process.start. And then of course, before returning to the editor, we'll wait for that process to exit as well. And that's it, we've set it up to actually run the editor, also run the game with the map we selected. Alright, so that pretty much wraps things up. So how about we give this a quick run and see how this bad boy performs. So let's hit the start button. Let's make a little tile map, so let's put the full tile set, pop some tiles down. We should make a different size brush, I think, moving forward. Okay, just fill that in. Alright. Let's save this map. Let's save this one as test map 3. Save. Let's hit our preview button. And there we have our tile map in our game project. All loaded up, all displaying as we expect it to. So this means moving forward we can actually preview our map, maybe pop down a character, have a little walk around and experience the game for what it is outside of the editor and in the actual game environment. Well, that's it for today, chaps. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please stay tuned. There is going to be more coming over the next few weeks now that I have settled into a stable role at work. So I have more time to dedicate to actually creating some content and getting it out there. I appreciate all your support and all your patience up to this point, and thank you ever so much for all the feedback. Please do stick around. I aren't going anywhere. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.